So let's think about space for a minute and how I look at it. So I go out and I look in my textbooks and my photographs and everything, and I realize that, well, there's a lot of order to the universe, and it's that order and how it came into being which is important to us. So we see that the Earth is round, which is almost inherently ordered. It's not a just diverse thing. It's actually an object which has a shape. We see that the Earth goes around the sun in a circle. We see that the sun goes around the center of our galaxy in roughly a circle. We see other stars in our galaxy go around. We see galaxies orbiting our galaxies. And we take these things. This is now going from very small scale, our Earth, to hundreds of thousands of light years, to even millions of light years with galaxies orbiting ours, to billions of light years with galaxies forming into great walls and voids. There's stuff here, there's not stuff there. And how did that object, because you can call it an object because it's got some physical parameters to it. How did that object form in the age of the universe? Remember, it's a billion light years across. I mean, a billion light years. It takes light a billion years to travel across this thing. The universe is only 13 billion years old. How did it have time to do that? Then I go and I take the measurements that I made when I was a graduate student, which is looking at the cosmic microwave background, which is the very beginning of the universe. And I look at there, and I say, what was the universe like back then? It was very smooth. It was almost no order at all. It was smooth to about 1 part in 100,000. So we take the beginning, nothing going on, and we take now, and it's incredibly ordered, and you have to ask, how did it evolve? You would not recognize our universe 13 billion years ago from what it is now. It's like looking at a fetus and saying, and I'm looking at a 97-year-old man, well, 45-year-old man, and saying, are these two things the same? And how do they evolve? So the way we do this is we think about how the universe looked at each point as it evolved. And what's really neat about doing cosmology is that I don't have to dig up in the ground and see some old rotted thing and infer what it was like when it was live and bouncing around. I can actually go and look at these objects. So if I look at a galaxy that's a billion light years away, I'm looking at light that's a billion years old. So I'm looking at that galaxy in the universe when it was only 12 billion years old. Look at one that's 7 billion light years away when the universe was only 7 billion years old. You get to see what the universe was like in its past just by, a couple $1 million, $100 million telescope, but you can do it. And so what you're doing is you're trying to make a measure of what the universe is like at several different epochs. And when you do that, you constrain how it evolved over time. And you can go into the many more than 7-minute lecture about the physical parameters, but suffice it to say, we can basically take the universe early on, throw in a bunch of physical parameters, turn a crank, and produce the universe that we see today.
Could a talk on space really be complete without talking about aliens? Not just intelligent beings, but what about genius ones? Or maybe just one. Herman Poole Blount was born on May 22, 1914 in Birmingham, Alabama. At the time, it was an important stopping point for jazz musicians like Duke Ellington and Fats Waller, and Herman, a skilled pianist from childhood, was greatly influenced by them. He would allegedly watch their performances and be able to transcribe them in full and from memory shortly thereafter, and began writing songs of his own at age 11. He proceeded as one might expect a budding musician to. He joined a band when his biology teacher asked him. When she left the group mid-tour, he assumed leadership. Like most beginning musicians, or really all musicians, they weren't financially successful. He was forced to return to Birmingham, where he found himself steadily employed by the local jazz clubs and eventually enrolled in college, studying music education. That's where what we really know ends. I suppose college is a time for transformational experiences. I'm certainly different than when I arrived here in fall of 2007, but not really that different. Herman, he was that different. He claims to have had an out-of-body experience in 1936, shortly after departing for school. He says, I could see through myself, and I went up. I wasn't in human form. I landed on a planet that I identified as Saturn. They teleported me, and I was down on a stage with them. They wanted to talk to me. They had one little antenna on each ear, a little antenna over each eye. They talked to me. The world was going into complete chaos. I would speak through music and the world would listen. That's what they told me. He reported this event years before UFOs became a topic of public discussion, and decades prior to the abductions of Barney and Betty Hill. I believe him. This personal mythology would define the rest of his life. He would rename himself Sun Ra and redevote himself to his music and the movement of Afrofuturism. Herman Poole Blount, that's an imaginary person. He never existed. Any name that I use other than Ra is a pseudonym. Like Malcolm X and Muhammad Ali, he dropped his so-called slave name as a step in achieving his new, true identity. His Afrofuturist viewpoint developed soon after his departure from Birmingham after a move to Chicago. Though he had always been an advocate of civil rights, having been subjected to such injustices as having to sit behind a curtain in certain clubs because the sight of his black skin horrified their white patrons, moving to Chicago brought a radical change in his surrounding racial climate. In the late 40s, Chicago was a center of political activism, with large movements of black Muslims and Hebrews visibly and vocally proselytizing. Sun Ra absorbed these performances and carefully studied the city's Egyptian-inspired buildings and monuments, convinced that the history of Africans had been suppressed by Europeans and their descendants. He was sent to Earth from outer space to save the world, or so he said. It was in Chicago that he met Alton Abraham. A teenager, he became one of the key proponents of the orchestra and a close friend and confidant to the introspective Sun Ra. Together, they formed El Saturn Records. The orchestra, the ever-changing group of musicians who would accompany Sun Ra, was born.
So, obviously, I'm a choreographer, and so the way that I'm thinking about space has a lot to do with human bodies in space and sort of moving human bodies throughout space, our own bodies and other people's bodies, in a way to change our perspective. So what I would like to do for the next 6.5 minutes is lead you through a choreography within this room and with each other. So don't be scared. I'm just going to give you very simple directions, and you can interpret them how you wish. They're pretty straightforward. So the first thing I'd like you to do is take your chair and turn it to face another person. Great. So is everybody facing somebody? Awesome. Now I'd like you to stand up within a very close proximity to that person. So get as close as you can to that person. Great. Now everybody grab your chair and maybe an extra chair, because I think we have a few extras, and move them into a circle that goes along the edges of the room. So one big circle. And then sit down in your chair. And when everybody's in a circle, just be quiet for one moment and make eye contact with everybody in the circle. Go ahead. So make sure that you make eye contact with each and every person at some point.
So we don't have much time to talk about it, obviously, but what I'd like to do quickly is talk about what cyberspace is not. So cyberspace is not a metaphor for the internet. You know, you hear this word like hurled around in the media. You hear like, you know, the afflictions of cyberspace, what happens to our privacy in cyberspace, et cetera. You know, if you're on Google, if you're reading articles on Wikipedia, if you're doing your research on LexisNexis, you're not in cyberspace. You know, you're using your computer to do things. Cyberspace is really about community. It's about allowing people to transcend boundaries and come together for various purposes, but more so to interact than anything else. So John Perry Barlow, who we'll come back to, really says it better than I think anyone has. Barlow says, cyberspace consists of transactions, relationships, and thought itself, arrayed like a standing wave in the web of our communications. Ours is a world that is both everywhere and nowhere, but is not where bodies live. So I think he really nails it with that. It's funny, a lot of tech geeks refer to the physical world, what we refer to as reality, as meat space due to our biological similarity to meat and so forth. Right? So I thought that was kind of clever. So the origin of the term actually comes from William Gibson. Anybody read William Gibson? Yeah, all right, good. Few cyberpunks, nice, I like that. So it was originally from a short story called Burning Chrome, 1982, and he made it famous in Neuromancer. So I'm going to read you a short excerpt from Neuromancer where he actually coins the term. What I want you to do when I read this is I want you to think about an instance of cyberspace that I think we all have some experience with, which is Facebook. So think about your experiences on Facebook as I read you this quote, and remember that this was written in 1984. The Matrix has its roots in primitive arcade games, cyberspace, a consensual hallucination experienced daily by billions of legitimate operators in every nation, by children being taught mathematical concepts, a graphic representation of data abstracted from the banks of every computer in the human system.